Randall, and today's the 26th of April, 1984. I'm at the University of British Columbia School of Social Work. Today I'm interviewing Mrs. Teresa Kaufman. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project, a project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Mrs. Kaufman, in order to get started, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born, and a little bit about your background.
Well, I was actually born in Leipzig, Germany, but I was an infant when my family moved to New York.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother died when I was about 4, and we were 6 children. And my father thought it might be better if he could make other arrangements. He was unable to cope with the 6. For a time, I spent something like 6 to 8 months in an orphanage. And you know, I really believe that's where I began to take an interest in other people. There were a lot of children there, and the children concerned me as much as I was concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And I really used to be upset when I saw these little kids cry and they had no parents. However, my own fate was somewhat different. My father made arrangements for my eldest brother and myself when I was 5 then, and he was approximately 14, to come to Vancouver, BC, to live with an aunt and uncle who had some years previously settled here. And they raised me as their daughter.
Mm-hmm. When did you come to Vancouver then?
About 1912.
Mm-hmm.
I still remember being picked up at the train station by my uncle and brought home in a horse and buggy. And it was quite exciting.
Mm-hmm. So you went to school here in Vancouver?
Then, of course, I started at 6 in a regular school. They were in business, incidentally. We're very busy people. And I was somewhat raised by housekeepers, you might say. But I went to school, in the regular school, and early in my school experience, it was discovered I had poor eyesight. So I've always worn glasses then, and always been short-sighted, for whatever that meant.
Mm-hmm.
However, I completed Central School. It no longer exists. It's Victory Square now, where that school stood then.
Mm-hmm.
And later went to high school. I went to another elementary school on Davie Street. We lived in the West End. And then I went to King George High School, where I graduated finally. My brother was here with me for about 2 years. He was going on to 16, and there was really nothing for him. He was too old to be adaptable into the family already, and he'd had a lot of experiences and I think was rather unhappy. So he went back to Chicago and joined his father, and later his father's family as he remarried. But I remained in Vancouver and was raised as an only child.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What did you do after you finished high school?
I wanted to go to university and take up social work, oddly enough. But my uncle didn't feel that it was urgent. Times were not good. They were very bad, as a matter of fact. And he suggested rather that I take a business course, which I did, shorthand, typing, and bookkeeping. And I worked for him for a time. He had a factory, a dress factory, and a lingerie factory as well. And they also had 1 or 2 stores here and there. And after a while, it seemed that things didn't go well with them either. And he was able to get me a job with a small wholesale firm run by a single person, where I did everything there, bookkeeping, secretary work, and selling, and what have you, small wares.
Mm-hmm.
This was about 1933 I'm talking about now.
Mm-hmm. Can I go back for just a second?
Yes.
You mentioned that you wanted to go to school to do
Yes.
social work. Had you heard about the profession
Um,
or things then?
At that point, it wasn't social work definitely in my mind. It was, I wanted to go to university. And I don't think that I had definitely known exactly what I wanted to pursue. But my uncle, who he'd gone through the mill himself and didn't quite see the need of that, nor whether the funds. So all right, I took the job for $10 a week, and then the worst days were being experienced then. And this chap, my boss, who had been inclined to gamble somewhat in the stock market, lost everything. And he committed suicide, as a matter of fact. So there'd been quite a bit of tragedy around the early days. And then I decided I was going to go to, I was looking for another job, rather, and I got a job as a typist only in a new office, and this should have some significance, a new office that was just being opened. It was in a little brick building on Cambie Street, 530, I even remember the address, which was the first relief office in Vancouver. And it was opened for a temporary period of time only. This was to be a temporary job for 6 months. They didn't expect it to exist after that length of time. It was just to relieve the terrible conditions that were in effect then. We were in the midst of a real depression at that point.
Do you recollect what year that was?
1933.
1933.
Yes.
So you started out with a temporary job as a
In the
typist.
relief office. And the clientele was really frightening. People coming for food vouchers. There was no such thing as handing out relief money, by the way. What they had there was a butcher shop. And people lined up to get a piece of meat. And they gave them vouchers for groceries. After a time, that was discontinued, and they began giving small sums of money. But the kind of relief people got in those days was nothing compared to what they are given now. In fact, they were later handed out seeds if they could grow anything themselves. Subsequent to that, I was still working there, but it didn't look very good for the future for me. I wasn't the greatest typist in the world. It wasn't my favorite subject, but I typed. And my boss still stood over my shoulder and said, you know, it should look like a picture, but mine never did. However, I heard my uncle, whom I now call father, told me he'd heard of a job that was opening up at the Jewish Community Center for a social worker. And I says, but I don't know anything about social work. And he says, well, there's nothing to it. All you have to do is give clothes and some food, and you can do that. So I thought to myself, well, I ought to be able to do that. And I applied for it. Now, I had a competitor who had much better qualifications for the job, but somehow or other, I got the job.
So when did you start with them?
July the 1st, 1934. I got it on the condition that I would take the training
That you would take the training?
in social work. I've omitted to tell you there was the years in between 1929 when there was a good year, 1928 when I went back to Chicago to visit my family. And then in that interim period, was only 1 year, my family had made money. And I was only on a visit, so I returned, and I said the thing I wanted most was to go to university. So 1929, I did spend at the University of British Columbia and got my first year complete. But that ended then because the crash came right after that, and they had no money left even to pay rent.
Mhm.
So that was an interim incident. But in 1934, I began my job at the Jewish Community Center. There was a board who employed me, sat around a table of about 15 people who interviewed me for that job, and I got the job. I think because I'd had a little experience in the relief office.
Mhm. Mhm. I'd like to hear more about that, about the organization and what
Yes.
they were doing. And
Well, the Jewish Community Center was then located at 11th and Oak. It was an old building, brick building. And I had a little office assigned me, which you could barely turn around in. But it was part of a larger office, the secretary's office. It was all run by volunteers. The actual board of the community center consisted of something like 30 or 40 people.
Hmm.
The individuals who employed me, there were about 15 involved. And one lady, Mrs. Shapiro, was assigned as my boss. She was a member of the board, a volunteer.
Mhm.
And as I've already said, they made the condition that I take the training. And I was eager to do so. I was very pleased that this opportunity arose. What I was earning at that first job to begin with was $50 a month. And I began to give my folks 25 of it, and the other 25 I went to university. As far as clothes were concerned, they made them anyway.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I got what clothes I needed, some not too suitable, but it was all right. Anyway, I remained on that position for 12 years.
Mhm.
And I was the only, I followed the first social worker whom they had employed, Vera Peters. She got married. Before she got married, she joined the Children's Aid Society for a while. She was the first social worker,
Mhm.
and it was then called the Hebrew Aid and Immigrant Society.
Mhm.
And I followed her, and as the second social worker who had been employed there for the $50 a month. And my clientele were mostly in the East End. I have never driven a car. My eyesight has never permitted that. And women didn't anyway then so much.
Mhm. So how did you get back?
I got around very well. Streetcars. Buses came in later. Streetcars and buses. And it was mostly in the East End area. Heatley, Gore, Union, those are the streets I visited quite frequently. Up into Campbell Avenue. And some of my clients, one particularly I remember so well, she lived in a little house underneath the Campbell Street Bridge. And her yard, it was a rented house, of course, which she paid practically nothing. She was on welfare, on relief, they called it then. And they had given her seeds, so she planted her garden there, and she had all her vegetables in that front garden, and all the neighbors came to get food there. This is the way people existed in those days.
Mhm.
They had to really work for their living.
Mhm.
But she did a good job of it. She was a good gardener. And we became very good friends, too. However, the type of situations I encountered were largely new immigrants from Poland and other Ukraine and other European centers where they'd been subjected to a great many difficulties, pogroms and what have you. They came to America convinced, I'm sure, that life here would be very good in comparison. And most of those people made their living by peddling junk. They had a horse and they had a wagon, and they picked up iron and the scraps and junk all over. I don't know whether you've seen that picture, The Lies My Father Told Me.
No, I haven't seen it.
Well, a little boy's grandfather did that, and it was a very good graphic picture of it.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, that's how they made their existence.
Mm-hmm.
Pennywise, you might say, penny by penny. And they would come to the Jewish Community Center for a little help here and there. We had very limited funds to give, but we gave what we could. My first day on the job, there was a long line of single men outside my door wanting money for food. There was no relief for single people, by the way. It was only for families so far.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked what I should do with them. I was really quite overwhelmed by this. They said, give them a quarter each. They'll go and get a lunch for that money at the White Lunch, which I did. And this became quite a habit.
Mm-hmm.
We also, these young fellows traveled across the country on the rails, you know, by hook or by crook, on the freight trains mostly. And there were accidents too among them. So one or two were killed that way, but this is what they did, looking for places to find work or to get free food or lodging. And it was a pretty grim sight. Also, there was very strict, extremely strict residence laws at that time. I think the provincial government found that it was being inundated with demands for food. Many people came out west because of the climate. For one thing, it was easier to live here than in the prairies when the conditions were so bad. Fuel would be a very large item for them. So the unemployed rolls swelled, as you can imagine. And therefore, they set down these extremely rigid laws, saying that if anyone came from any of the other provinces to Vancouver, and they were referring mostly to families again, they would have to be deported back, as though you were deporting them to another totally different country,
Mm-hmm.
because they were not going to be financed here.
Mm-hmm. Now, the people of whom you're speaking, would they have gotten? How would they have gotten to your agency?
They were Jewish. The ones that I'm referring to were Jewish, but of course this was a general thing. But the Jewish ones would seek out the Jewish agency, the Jewish Hebrew Aid and Immigrant Society,
Right.
in the phone book. And they'd find us at the Jewish Community Center.
Would they have been refused relief from the public office?
Well, I was just coming to
I'm
that.
sorry.
I was just going to give you an illustration of this. One family, as I recall, and this was a repetitive kind of thing, with 6 children, came out to Vancouver in an open car, a jalopy, an old Ford. Didn't even have a hood on it. And that's how they reached Vancouver from, I believe it was Saskatchewan, I'm not sure. At any rate, they had nothing. Then the father in the family tried to eke out a living by manufacturing his own soap. You can well imagine what that would be like. He did it at home and selling it door to door, which of course was a complete fiasco. They were here. They arrived at my office. This is just an illustration of some of the things that happened. And wanting help. So I took it to I always had to take major items to my own board, of course. Small items I could spend money on, but they had to be very small. And our board, well, in the first step there was to check with the provincial office, the relief office. I phoned them. It was Mr. Tubman. I don't know if his name means anything to you, but he was in charge in the Vancouver area. And I told him about this family with 6 rather young children. The oldest was a teenager. And what were we going to do about it? He says, don't touch it. This was his answer, and I still remember it. Don't touch it with a 10-foot pole. This is how rigid they were in those days.
Why did you say that?
Well, I was just flabbergasted. What were we going to do? So I took it to my own board, and I says, we cannot send these people. In the midwinter, snow on the ground. We simply cannot send these people back to Saskatchewan. They have nothing to go back on. And the car, by the way, he sold it. How he sold it, I don't know, because it wasn't worth much. But they had nothing to go back in either. So they agreed to give a few dollars. A few dollars for 6-8 people isn't very much, but that's what they gave. And then a bright idea suddenly struck me. I don't have too many bright ideas, but this time I think I did. This lady was a real good housekeeper, good Jewish cook. And I said, why don't we send our boys, instead of sending them to the White Lunch, to her? Let's rent a house. Let her pay for the rent, but let's pay for the boys. And this is exactly what we did. So she took in all the single men that came along thereafter, and they got by on that. Not very lustily, but they got by because they could get no other kind of help. And they remained in Vancouver. After a while, the husband came to me and said that if he had could get out into the country and had some means of planting, they would grow things and be able to live better. So we located some property they got very cheap on a rental basis, of course, with a little old shack on it, which they decided was very good. And we got them $50 worth of seeds, whole $50 worth.
Must have been a lot.
Yeah, and he got busy and started planting, and they lived out there for a while, but that too was extremely difficult. But they managed to get by briefly. Incidentally, they needed furniture, and I went ahead and bought it, and I was bawled out and put on the carpet for having done it. I said, what do you expect them to sleep on the floor? We had a struggle in those days to get anything, a real struggle.
Can I ask you a question? You've mentioned a couple of times now that people rented, of course. Was that the way that things were done? That many people would rent and very few people would own their own homes?
Oh, and no one could afford to own their homes in those days. There wouldn't be the means to buy a place. And the rent, unfortunately, wouldn't always get paid either, But they managed to exist. And it usually was an old, dilapidated place that cost very little in the East End. I had one experience, and I want to tell you, this is another illustration, where a couple, and they had a horse and wagon. This is how he made his food, you might say. And they had rented, again, a basement suite, a very small one. One thing, redeeming feature about that basement suite was that it had good plumbing. The rest of it was ready to fall down. But they took that place. I had nothing to do with this. This was their own initiative. They took that place and they kept their horse in the backyard because there was grass for him to eat. This is how people existed in the early Depression. And they had very little equipment. They had no dishes. They had nothing. No pots. So I went ahead and to a secondhand junk shop on Main Street and bought a few things for them, which they were delighted to get. But I had to answer for that at a 40-member board meeting for having done it, because not only wasn't it authorized, you were put in a spot often, because even if you got an authorization, they were in doubt what to do, sometimes. It wasn't kosher, and these were Jewish people, and this is to some people, some of the members was extremely important. It never even occurred to me. I thought I was thrilled to bits to get them,
Mhm.
However, they were happy, and they lived, and also upstairs, this particular house that they lived in, they were only in the basement, belonged to a Negro family, and there was some feeling about that too. We went through quite a few unnecessary difficulties that way.
Mhm.
So, um, anyway, they managed to eke out an existence in this fashion because he peddled.
Mhm.
Then, coming back to my first family, they planted seeds and they grew vegetables out there in the country. But the children got sick. We had to get them into they had double pneumonia, get them into the hospital through by ambulance. No one ever paid the ambulance.
Mhm.
And they had a very difficult time.
Mhm.
But we continued to help them. The Jewish Agency had, as I said, had very limited funds. They were a very good family, good potentially, good. Those kids were bright. They had a hard time. They went without suitable clothing. But I had a basement in the building where I was working, and we got clothing collected for everybody.
Mhm.
And they came in, they just ransacked that place. People wouldn't touch that clothing today,
No.
but they were glad to get it.
Mhm.
Another incident, which I think is particularly valuable from the point of view one shouldn't ever give up hope, is another couple who had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. They were going to school. The man had been dealing with a cattle firm in Alberta and had been traveling back and forth on their behalf. But he had to have, his car broke down, and he had one bad thing after another happen to him. And I guess the firm also wasn't doing very well. And apparently prior to my coming there, the agency, that is the agency I worked for, had given them some help. But he hadn't made the best. He had fixed his car and it didn't go anyway. So this was a blow. Didn't work. So here they were, and the woman had a lot of strengths. She said if we only could get a decent car, he could get his connections probably back. So I said, well, what's going to take to do that? So $50 seems to be a magic sum, but that was about it. Not a great deal, you would say, but then it seemed to be.
Would have been a lot.
Yeah. So she said to me, if only we could. And I said, well, you know what happened before, and they're not going to look on it too favorably now. And she says, well, make it a loan. And I knew in my own heart that those people would never be able to pay back a loan. At any rate, I suggested a little, maybe I shouldn't repeat this, but anyway, a little, what do you call it, trickery. I said, look, you go and visit Mrs. So-and-so. Don't tell her I sent you. And see if we won't consider giving you some help in this direction.
One of the board members, you
Yeah,
suggested she go.
my boss, my
Uh-huh.
immediate boss.
Mhm.
She was a very good person, but she had a terrible responsibility to make a few dollars go a long way.
Yeah.
Anyway, she did this. She went to her home and talked to her, and I knew she was a soft-hearted person. And it wasn't long afterwards she phoned me and says, you know something, Mrs. So-and-so's come to visit me. What shall we do? I said, well, what are you suggesting we do? So she said, well, she's asked for $50 to help get him started again. You know, we gave the money before, and it didn't do one bit of good. And people had a tendency then to judge other people very freely. If they didn't succeed, then they must be a failure,
Mhm.
you see. So I said, well, how about it, giving them another chance? And let's see if it doesn't work this time. And, well, all right, we'll do that. So we gave him the money. And he did get his car, or a different car or something, fixed up. And he got back on the road, and they did make it. And those people have done very well since then, because that's many years ago.
Mhm.
But you see, this is the sort of thing. People were very quick, sensitive, very quick because they couldn't produce the kind of help that was really needed, they resorted to blame and judgments and all sorts of things. Besides, they were not trained people on the job. They were all volunteers.
You say that because they couldn't give the kind of help that was really needed. And what was
And
needed?
economics in those days were disastrous.
Mhm.
And therefore, somebody had to be blamed for all this. It couldn't be you or I, sort of thing. We always worked hard, they would say. Most of those women and men that were on the board were hard-working people. They weren't in that situation. It wasn't that they were unsympathetic. They were sometimes went overboard with their sympathy. It was irrational very
Mhm.
often.
Mhm.
But it was just that they couldn't understand how this can all happen.
Sure.
And they had very little to work with. They would have liked to have done better, I think.
Where did the resources for the agency come from?
Well, from the community. You see, the United Way didn't exist at that time. There was no such thing.
Mhm.
I'm still talking to those pre-days when there was very little help from any source. So you had to get it from wherever you could.
And was that part of your responsibility too?
To raise funds, no, thank goodness it wasn't. I had to spend the money. Incidentally, this story is not complete without telling about the young fellows who landed up on the post office floor and the police sprayed them out. I witnessed part of that.
What had happened? Could you give us a little
Well,
background on that?
I must tell you, I got a call one day that it was a young man who was in need, desperately in need. But apparently he had been in trouble with the law too. And he was housed in a little shack. I don't know how he got up there, something up in a tree practically. He had to climb up there to get in. And I went to see him. And I gave him a couple of dollars. That's all I could give him. But this is where he was hiding out. And the next day, I just by chance happened to walk into the post office, which I went into periodically, naturally. And I saw all these young men, I would say a couple hundred of them, lying on the floor. And this is the post office on the corner of Hastings and Granville, the old post office. And the police were, this fella that I'd given the $2, who was handing out leaflets, communist material. This is probably why he was in trouble.
Mhm.
But the police were on them and they hosed them out.
Mhm.
They had to get out.
What did you think about what was going on there?
Well, I had no idea. There was just nothing for those poor fellows. They had no help from any source, you see.
Mhm.
And they were, most of them, just starving, half starved, except where they could grab a meal here and there. Many of them lived under the Georgia Viaduct.
Mhm.
They stayed there
Mhm.
for shelter. So I always remember that little episode. It seems, and I've lost the trend here a bit, but it seemed not long after they began to institute some help for the single people, as well as the families. It still was very limited, but they did get some help later.
British Columbia started a couple of 260 or something like that, work camps.
Yes,
Sometime
that's
around
right.
that
I
period of
think it
time.
was around that time. They sent many of them off to those work camps, that's right. And the conditions slowly improved. This was now, you know, in the meantime, Hitler was spouting off wild and furious in Europe. And we used to listen to some of his excitable charades on the radio. We didn't have a TV. And that was before the outbreak of the war.
Mhm.
The war changed everything.
What were you hearing in the mid-30s? As a member of the Jewish
Well,
community in the mid-30s, you were hearing...
It was pretty awful. He spoke in German, of course, and it's only if you knew German you knew what he was saying, but his tone of voice was enough without that. And we could hear the verdammtes Juden, which in German is the damn Jews, you know.
Mhm.
And we used to listen to him, what was going on there. The rest of the world weren't listening very well, by the way, at that point.
Mhm.
Anyway, he brought on the World War, as you know. And when the outbreak of the World War, when they began to recruit soldiers, a lot of the problems became diluted.
The economic problems.
The economic problems, because they were joining up the forces. What else should they do, you know?
Sure. Mhm.
And conditions were gradually improving then.
With the development of the Second World War, because there were hostilities in 37, 38.
Oh, yes, all the way through from 33. He became chancellor in 33.
33. Was the work of your agency at all,
Yes.
no, I don't mean concerned with, but involved in?
We were involved in that a little later, and I'll tell you about that.
So that was later on.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Before the World War, it wasn't too evident what was happening, except that we did hear a great many stories. But right after the war, there were droves of refugees. As a matter of fact, my mother-in-law, who was then 70, all her family, nephews and nieces, were in concentration camps. And she was instrumental in getting, part of the family were in France. She was instrumental through her connections to get them out. It took money.
Mhm.
And they were brought to Paris, and they were dispersed to various parts of the world. She came to live with us,
Mhm.
my husband's mother. She lived with us 10 years from, and but during that period, there were droves of refugees coming, and we got our share here in Vancouver.
Mhm.
They were very distraught. We raised funds for a situation like that. It wasn't that difficult to raise money anymore, you see.
Mhm.
They raised funds to help them on transit. Some went to Australia, some to South America, some to the Orient, some to other places. Not many to the States, a few to the States, and some remained here.
Mhm.
As a matter of fact, Dr. Lindenfeld, who has passed away some years ago, was a psychiatrist here in Vancouver. She and her husband and her son came. I still remember the day they arrived. Her son was just a boy then. He was a sickly boy. He had tuberculosis. She had to do, what do you call this, when you take hair out in order to make a living, and he was a skin specialist. He went up north to do some, to help some of the people up there medically. They both had to take exams again, of course,
Mhm.
but they had a hard time getting settled. But she became a prominent psychiatrist here later,
Mhm.
and her son at the moment is a professor at University in New York.
Mhm. Mhm.
But at any rate, it was a pretty tragic sight. They would come into our building, and of course not only I was involved in that, everybody was. The Canadian Jewish Congress was formed, you see, and they were all involved in helping the refugees.
There are a number of, a few more questions that I'd like to
Mhm.
discuss with you about that. I'm wondering, do you want to go on now, or do you want to
Yeah,
take a
no,
break
it's
for a few
okay.
minutes? It's okay?
Mhm.
To go back to 1939 or so, with the outbreak of, or the involvement of Canada in the war, and
Mhm.
people joining up in the service, how did the war affect your clientele and the work that you were doing at the
Well,
agency?
yes, this is rather interesting, I think. See, these chaps who have been peddling with horses and looking pretty crummy, really, and this horrible junk they were peddling. I mean, they were picking it up. They made money. They sold scrap iron to for arms. And those people became more or less established in business. They are business people in our community today.
Mm-hmm.
And they're, at least their sons and daughters are, you know, and they, some of them too are still. But they're the old timers. They made their living. After that, they became established. Like that gentleman I told you that needed the car and had no money, he made a good living after that.
Mm-hmm.
They became fairly successful. The war helped them.
Mm-hmm.
And I won't say they all got rich, but they at least found a means to make a decent living. And no longer would you see the horse and buggy pedaling around. That old creepy buggies they used to, not buggy, but they were little carts, you know, that they pulled around with poor old tired horses.
Yeah.
You know? That's no longer, that disappeared from the scene altogether after that time. And I was still in the agency until 1947, all through that period when the refugees were being resettled and the families were being better established, and at the same time the government was giving more help. The residence laws were relaxed a bit, and the United Way wasn't called the United Way then. What was it called then? Oh dear, my memory's not the best. But it had another, United Way is a more recent name.
Mm.
But it was this, in essence, the getting together of all agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Incidentally, I didn't mention in the meantime I was going to school.
Mm-hmm.
All during this period. I never stopped school. Summer, evenings. I didn't have my BA degree. I had 1 year university.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to go summer school, night school, after school.
Mm-hmm.
I did one course by correspondence, economics of all things, part of it anyway. And then in 1947, my boss said to me, you know, well, I was getting $100 a month by then. Tremendous sum of money.
Your salary had doubled
Yeah.
in those years.
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, they gave me 75, and I was there about 6 months. But she phoned and said, you know, we don't have much money and we can't give you an increase. And I said, well, that's too bad, okay. But then it struck me that maybe I, you know, during that last year or two at the Jewish Agency, I haven't told you anything about the courses out here.
I'm interested in that.
Yeah, I will tell you about that. They gave me a student for the first time. And she's still around. I see her often. My first student. And she said to me, why don't you go, she was the one that suggested it, why don't you go to Children's Aid Society? So I thought, well, maybe it is time for a change.
Mm-hmm.
So I made the change in August 47
Mm-hmm.
to the Children's Aid Society, and I was there for 24 years and a half.
Okay, maybe that'd be a good place to start for a few minutes,
Yeah.
shall we? Okay, Mrs. Kaufman, to begin again then, you mentioned during the time that we were having coffee that you had something to do with the change in name of the agency that you had been at. How did that come about?
Well, it occurred to me while I was doing my field work and in training for social work at the Family Service Agency of Vancouver, that we should be in line with the general philosophy of family service. Because originally the name of the agency was Hebrew Aid and Immigrant Society, which restricted it somewhat to a service to new immigrants, although they did include other people, but largely they were immigrants at that time. So it was brought up at the board, and they did decide to change it to Jewish Family Service Agency, which is what it's called today.
Mm-hmm.
And it's simpler and much more understandable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So as I was saying, I left that agency in 1947.
Okay.
Was there anything more you wanted to know about
Well,
it?
yes, there are a couple other things, if you don't mind continuing on for a few minutes. My mind has gone blank for
Yeah,
a
that's
moment.
okay.
Um, you had mentioned that when the war started, many of the people with whom you had been dealing were able to make their way and away from the
Conditions
agency
improved.
too.
Mhm.
Did your clientele change then?
No, yes, somewhat it did, because it was more of a service directed towards the broader community, the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that the powers that be, the board, saw that there were different ways of helping other people as well. And it was imperceptible. I mean, we didn't suddenly decide today that we're going to do this now. It had been happening gradually anyway. I mean, there were other people in the community who had suffered during the Depression who were not new immigrants, and they were needing help as well. And when we were in a better position to give that service, along with the fact that the city and the province were more willing to advance funds for people, my services became more general in the general population, among the Jewish community I'm speaking.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, people might need referrals to the city for help, which we could not give perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But this happened gradually. It became a fact of life without us realizing it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the clientele were those who were formerly new immigrants were now established citizens.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them have taken out citizenship by now. You know, it takes something like 5 years to, at that time at any rate, to get a citizenship. And they considered themselves Canadians, no longer immigrants. But there were those among them who still needed a good deal of help anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Widows, there again, during the war years, there were those who lost their spouses. And they were in a spot and they needed help, and they got it from various sources, but often came to the Jewish Agency for counseling or for help in different directions. Then there were the sick people, because our medical programs then weren't all that great. As you know, the Medicare as we have it today is something that came into existence in more recent years. So there were the sick people still. There were always those who were needing quite a bit of help. But the type of situation was more like the general population would require.
Mm-hmm. And during those years, you had been going to school all the time.
Yes.
In what ways did the manner in which you did your work change? How did your professional education?
I worked part-time, you see. This was still at the Jewish Agency. And I worked part-time. They allowed me the hours to go to the university for my course. I only took 2 courses at a time. I hadn't the time to take more. And I still carried my caseload.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes it meant after hours a bit too. But that never worried me too much, really. The salary I got didn't warrant it worrying them too much either. I'm referring to the board now.
Yeah.
But anyhow, that's how I was able to. Now, I realized that without a BA degree, the social work degree would be incomplete. And I was taking academic courses as well in the evenings.
Mm-hmm.
I only had 1 year, and I wanted to get a BA.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to summer school. In my holidays, that's where I spent my holidays mostly, and evening courses and such. And I did most of it that way. I finally got a BA degree much later, in 1960.
Mm-hmm.
But at any rate, coming back to this, I started at the School of Social Work in 1934 when I began this job. I started with that. And at that time, it was Laura Holland and Zella Collins who directed the school.
Mm-hmm.
They were old timers. And Mary McFedrin, I don't know if that name means anything to you, but she was head of the Family Service Agency.
Mm-hmm.
And in those days, the curricula of the School of Social Work was still somewhat unsettled, I think. They were exploring and experimenting with different courses. And I took them all. And I was no great student in the beginning there because I think it was rather heavy load that I was carrying. But I liked it, I enjoyed it. And I've not gone into this, but I had been brought up as a very silent person. Now you notice I'm no longer silent. But I think I gained a lot more confidence in myself when I was taking that training.
Mm-hmm.
And more so that I was able to articulate things I never could at home.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Any rate, when did Marjorie Smith, the head of the School of Social Work, come? I think 1942, something of that sort. I can't remember the exact year. The whole original curricula was scrapped. Nearly all, not all of it, but nearly all. And she initiated a new curricula more suitable to the present day, at that time, requirements. And I took some private lessons, classes rather, not lessons, but classes with her, along with Ruby McKay, if that means anything to you.
It does.
And Patricia, she's now Fulton.
Mm-hmm.
I've forgotten her maiden name. But a group of us, a small group of us, took special classes with Marjorie Smith, and we got a great deal out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Marjorie Smith encouraged me to take students. She thought I had something to offer, which was very nice of her. And I got a lot from that. And then in the summer school, we were really privileged because we had Gordon Hamilton, who is now dead, who gave courses, and I took her courses. And another summer, there was a visiting professor, well known to us, if I could think of her name, who also gave courses on foster home placements. So I really had advantages that many don't have, because I had some of the best lights in the field,
Mm-hmm.
give the training. And because I took it in this fashion, I had those advantages.
Over a period of
Over
time.
a period of time, summer school. I never failed to sign up for them, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
and the evening classes. So along with my academic training, which I took in the evenings one at a time, I got a good deal. In 1944, Marjorie Smith presented me with a diploma. I couldn't get a degree because I had no background for a degree yet.
Mm-hmm.
But I did get her diploma. And as time went on, other courses were changed, particularly in administration. There were new ideas promoted, and I wished I could remember everybody's name, but I don't. But there were visiting professors who gave these courses, one from Chicago, and another, I think, from New York. I'm not sure about that. But at any rate, these were additional training. And then I went to a seminar in a very delightful place outside Seattle when Lucille Austin gave a very exciting sort of a course.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had some very good instructors that way. just to follow that through a bit, I finally got my BA degree in 1960, but I decided I'd like to get my MSW. And in 1962, I took a year off from work. By this time, I was working at Children's Aid Society. And I took that year off and got my degree, my MSW. Incidentally, it wasn't in this lovely building. It was in, I laugh every time I think of it, in the agricultural setting, a husbandry department. They have an old building there. And the worst thing about it, I can say, is it just swarming with flies. Between courses, we were battling the flies. It was really something to behold. And I'm not exaggerating. They were there in droves. And I think probably because of the cattle thereabouts, you know. But at any rate, that's where I got my final training.
Mm-hmm. Did you have to do a field placement again?
Yes, I did my first field placement, my very first field placement at the Girls Industrial School. That's in the beginning when I started out. That was on Cassiar Street. And Mrs. Westman was in charge then. And I had quite an experience there, I must say. These kind of experiences are indelible in one's mind, really. I remember walking into a room and one of the girls was trying on a brassiere or something of the sort. She was half undressed. I didn't know this. And she swore at me under her breath for walking in there. It was my duty, by the way, to walk in here and there and to observe. I was really like a little policeman. Not very good at that, but that's what I was there for. And also take histories. Okay, I thought about this quite a bit, and after a while I said to her, look, I said, I didn't know you were trying on your clothes. If I'd known, I don't think I would have come in. I says, but I think you can be a lady and you don't need to swear at me, but I understand it. You know, she became a real sweet person after that. She kind of appreciated that. And it struck home with me that it's the way you treat a person.
And you were not to knock before you came in.
Well, I didn't knock, you see. I walked in.
Yeah.
And it was the fact that I spoke to her afterwards and got her to feel more comfortable about it, that she responded rather well. But I had to sit in the waiting room and observe while they had their visitors. This was unpleasant for me. But I enjoyed those girls in a way. I used to tell them stories and they just loved it.
You would be in the waiting room and observe while they were having their visitors. What would you do with your observations? What?
I'd have to report it to if there was anything. The main purpose of that was that they wouldn't hand little knives or articles across that they had no business to do, you know, any subterfuge of that nature that might take place there. And to observe also their behavior in general, which I did. I learned a great deal from those girls. This was my very first placement. The second placement I had was with the Family Service Bureau. And I had Elizabeth Grubb as my supervisor. And that was quite a good experience too. That was much later. So.
And then was there a third field placement with your MSW?
I'm trying to think, was there? No, not really. I spent quite a lot of time at the Family Service Agency. But then you see, I went to the Children's Aid Society to work afterwards. Right. And that's where I remained for the following 24 and a half years as a supervisor. I went in as a supervisor because I had already had students. And I began with 5 students at a time. They had a lot of courage, you know, when you come to think of it.
Who did?
Huh? The agency, Dorothy Coombe. Any rate, I knew very little about the ins and outs of child welfare, but I learned an awful lot of that agency.
You were supervising students and
from the university.
you also had a caseload of your own?
Yes, well, yes, I had a caseload too, that's
Mhm.
right. And as usual, my caseload was in the East End or the West End. That's where I generally worked because it was easier to get around there. You know, taking a car was no great advantage in those areas
Yeah.
because you could walk just as quickly with it if you didn't have to park a car.
Yeah. And you didn't drive anyway.
And I didn't drive.
Mhm. Over the years that you were with the Children's Aid Society, let's say, I guess you began in child protection. did
Yes.
you? And
Yes,
did you
right
stay-
from the beginning it was child protection, but the child protection division includes a great many things.
What kinds of things does it?
Well, we did some adoptions, although weren't the adoption department, but it would occur. Work with unmarried mothers, a fair amount of that. Because of the implication being child protection, of course. But those areas would be definitely part of your daily work. I was an apprehending officer, which meant I would have to go out at all hours of the day or night to pick up children, and which we often did.
There was a lot of apprehensions in those days?
Yes, now I worked very closely with the court worker, and we had a great many courts and cases that we shared in this respect. She did the actual court work. I did a considerable amount of evidence giving and so on. The protection work was most interesting. We changed our views about many things so often in that area. I think we were more, I don't like to use the word harsh, we were more impressed by the neglect of children earlier. As time went on, I think most of us that worked with this, began to feel the parents needed a great deal more help than they were getting. And this would change our approach a bit too. So as you see, our whole thinking had to be geared to the real needs of people. And today, I'm quite certain that many times, if there'd been the resources, we might have been able to prevent some of the apprehensions we made. Not all of them, because some were pretty drastic situations. These would be people who were taking drugs, the parents, or they were completely neglectful. I'm thinking of one family, for example, where I was called out at about 2:00 in the morning. There were 6 little children there. The parents had disappeared. A neighbor had called in the police department. Police had called us. And they had been alone for 24 hours without food. Well, there was no alternative but to take those children into care and place them in foster homes. This sort of thing happened from time to time. Child abuse has been highlighted so much today. It rather amazes me in one way. Another way, I can understand what's happening. We had it less often. We did have cases of child abuse. Maybe they're more aware of it now. Also, the superintendent of child welfare initiated this law that you had to report, anyone had to report a known child abuse case
Is this recently?
to authorities.
Recently?
Yes.
This law was passed?
Well, it's not too recent, it's a few years now, but it's been used more. And this wasn't our major emphasis in those days. Our major emphasis was general neglect.
You mentioned a minute ago that you're feeling that had the resources been there, you wouldn't have had to apprehend so many
Yes.
kids. At that time, which is nearly 40 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
did you know what resources were required?
No. I'll tell you, when I was still at the Jewish Agency, I'm going back to that, there was one family I'm thinking of now, and this could illustrate what I'm getting at. There were 3 children. The parents were odd ducks. The mother was mentally not quite balanced. The father wasn't with it. He would disappear and they wouldn't know where he was, and suddenly he'd come home and bring the kids all kinds of things and just deluge them with gifts and money and what have you. He didn't have much money, but he didn't make sense in what he was doing. And his wife would put him in jail for having deserted her or some such thing. The next day she'd go and get him out and bring him home again, you know, this sort of thing. They were totally irresponsible. The children stayed, we had no foster homes then, there was no such thing in that time. And those children stayed with their parents, and they loved their parents, and their parents loved them. They were just like 2 more children, less responsible than the children. However, the girl particularly took a hold of things. She was in her early teens, and they lived in a dilapidated place, and also in the East End, like most of them. And we got together and got the landlord to kind of patch it up a bit, a little papering here and there. And those kids stayed together, and that family, they survived it. They survived it by their wits, you might say. They survived because they were able, they got a little help from us and whatever resources we could muster at that time from the city. And I don't think they were any worse off than the children that we sometimes put in foster homes. You see? Now, later years, at the Children's Aid Society, I'm coming back to that, our agency, and I'm talking about the Children's Aid Society now, initiated a homemaker program. It had already been in operation at the Family Service Agency long before that. The homemaker service began at the Children's Aid Society, I would say now, a few years before I so-called retired. I went on to another job then. We trained them. They were mostly women, 6 of them, on welfare, who wanted to do some work. And I took part in the training of these women and discussing what was needed and how they could help these families. And this was an experiment. This was the kind of resource that had been needed and wasn't in existence before. And 2 or 3 of us took part in developing that program. And I must say that it became a very interesting, exciting experiment, because instead of taking those children out of the home, we placed a homemaker with them who helped keep things in balance. Now, it doesn't always work. In fact, nowadays, I'm afraid, and I'll talk about that a little later because I have experience with homemaker service later. But at that time, that was a very valuable service. When I left, they made a little party for me, that group. It was really rather touching and presented, and there were people on welfare and they couldn't really afford it, but they presented me with a little figurine which I was rather pleased to get. But it wasn't just myself, it was the agency promoted this. And there are other ways of helping that they could be helped with.
But you didn't know that.
We didn't know that before. We were just feeling our way, just as the School of Social Work was feeling its way. Don't believe it for 1 minute that everything that took place here was well established in that way. Principles were, the philosophy was sound, but there was so much that hadn't been tried.
I want to go back for a minute to the question of resources, particularly for child welfare. You were at the Children's Aid Society from 1947 to 1972, I believe?
Right.
Thanks to your notes. I know that. I understand that during the late 50s, there was a fair bit of discussion, if not dissension, about resources for child welfare. That some of the senior bureaucrats in child welfare had been pressing for more resources.
They
And
still are.
still are. And that in fact, Ms. McKay resigned because of
Yes.
what she felt was an inadequate attention to resources for child welfare. You were working in a local agency then. How were you affected by that interplay and that dissension?
Well, we were all a part of it. I think that, we felt from time to time somewhat frustrated, but I don't know whether we had a full appreciation of what could be done. Because we weren't sure what resources could be made available. I think the main issue here is, do you gain by accepting certain severe situations? Do you gain by removing children from their homes? Also, what outside research, see nowadays there's so much offered youngsters. If they have a poor relationship at home, they have an opportunity to establish one in their group situation, in the school, and auxiliary kind of things like, the church groups, the clubs that they can go to. There are a lot of things open to children nowadays, learning experiences. In fact, I don't think they rely on their parents nearly as much as they did then. Maybe that's just an opinion. It may not be. They do rely on the parents for stability and for love, and maybe that most of all. But they are earlier, they're educated much earlier and much more free to express themselves, so that there is more attention given to what their needs are. It still has a long ways to go. I'm thinking of Israel for one moment, and I don't know whether this would be apropos or not, but there the system is, I'm not selling it because it's not the only way, but it has something to offer maybe. There, the parents and the children, they live in some of them do, in what they call a kibbutz. And they have expert guidance. Now, the children are looked after well. They are given good diets. They're sort of in a commune, you see. And they go home to their parents after that. They have their dinner with their parents. They have their evenings with their parents. The parents work. Mm-hmm. But they have the specialties looking after them during the day, so that this offsets any detrimental influence there might be in the home. Now, if we could adapt some of these principles, I'm not saying we should just go over holus bolus and do this, but if we could offer more outside guidance to parents as well as to the children, more support to I don't think the parents ever got enough support. Mm-hmm. And that was the idea of the homemaker service. The only thing failing there is there are not enough of them. They're not there long enough.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it could prevent many unhappy situations. And even if it is an unhappy situation, the child doesn't need to suffer that much, in other words.
Would this have been the kind of stand that Ms. McKay and people who were on who had those interests were trying to promote, more support for the parents?
Yes, I think so. I think Ruby McKay particularly felt that the parents should be given more help than they were. Mm-hmm. You know, there's some people, for instance, who say that an adopted child should meet, if desirable, their natural parents in the end. There was too much stigmatism attached to being an unmarried mother. That's another thing. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, it isn't so much. This may be a good thing and a bad thing, you know. I mean, it's not a bad thing, the astigmatism, but that rather there should be more help for that person to establish herself than there was.
Mhm.
I incidentally wrote my thesis on child mothers. Well, that was a younger mother. And there I mentioned that they were given an awful lot of help during the time of pregnancy, but not afterwards. Afterwards, the grandparents had to take over the care of the child.
Mhm.
And the interest is dissipated, I mean, is no longer there. And the mother, who is still very young, has not had enough opportunity to enjoy her life freely, to develop her interests. Now, these things can be offset. They can be helped if there's sufficient guidance, if there's sufficient resources for the children too.
Mhm.
I don't know if I make myself clear, but
Yes, yeah, I see that, and I'm tying it in with the debate which was going on in the 50s and evidently still continues in British
yes.
Columbia today.
Well, I think it's helping parents to keep their children at home and to make a good job of it.
Mhm.
And yet, you know, in the old days they went overboard. They either swallowed up their children, you know, protected them to such a degree that they were unable to cope with life satisfactorily without that.
Mhm.
Or they were completely, we can't stand you, you know, go away.
Yeah, yeah.
This was true particularly in the relief years, and I think this bothered Ruby because they had no money and they couldn't feed their children properly, and they worried them, so the tendency might be among certain people to neglect them altogether, just to forget they're there, to survive. If you follow me, the mother,
Mhm.
I feel this is the only way she could survive, is to push them away.
Sure,
Whereas this shouldn't have been necessary.
but because the amounts of relief were so terribly limited.
Yes, but it isn't only the money, it's the lack of training too on the part of the mother how to cope
Yeah.
with daily life problems.
Yeah. Okay,
I
during,
think that there is more of that now, more parental involvement in learning about child welfare and that sort of thing.
one would hope that that's the case.
Yes.
I'm not sure, thinking back over my own experience as a parent, whether that's true or not, but perhaps it should have been. During the time you were at the Children's Aid Society, there were a number of developments in other provinces, and I'm not sure what happened here.
Mm-hmm.
Provincial governments generally became more and more involved in child welfare and indeed took over Children's
Yes.
Aid Societies. Did that happen here during your time?
Oh, definitely. That happened the year I left the agency, when the provincial government took over and it became Human Resources. And no longer was a Children's Aid Society. And I honestly don't know how well that's functioning, but I have some doubts.
Mhm.
I have some apprehension, I'd say, about it. You see, after all, the Children's Aid Society, which was set up under a charter to serve children's needs, requirements, concentrated on that. And the emphasis was on good child welfare. It may not have always been so good, but at least that's what they tried to produce. Whereas now, you have an agency that's doing everything. And the fear was, and I don't know how real that fear should be, that it would be relegated to a lesser, not necessarily a lesser importance, but the time-wise, the sharing of responsibilities would be difficult. I know that the child welfare workers try their best, but after all, they are now coping with finances and they're coping with a lot of other things as well, all in the same office.
Mhm.
And one thing has a bearing on the other too there. this could be good, but it could also be that they overlook some of the things we were very much concerned about.
Mhm. During the last year then, that you were at the Children's Aid Society and during the last year of its existence as a separate agency, what kind of discussion was taking place within the agency and within the social work community? Did you have warning that this was going to happen?
I must tell you about that. I attended an annual meeting in which Norman Levy, he was the Minister of Human Resources that year, and he came in towards the end of our meeting, the annual meeting, to announce, and there was the press there as well, to announce that from such a date, and I don't recall that, it would be no longer Children's Aid Society, it would be Human Resources Ministry, under the Ministry of Human Resources. And we were all we had heard about it, but not as definite as that. And Dorothy Beck was then president of the organization. And she attempted valiantly to offer more discussions on the subject, that they could spend more time in talking it out. But evidently there was no time offered. It was done peremptorily, in that fashion. I'm sure they had some warning, but it wasn't generally understood. And I know that they had many meetings about this, but they gained nothing. The province decided that it was more expedient to have it all under one roof, and that they could administer it better in some way or another.
This was not a social credit government either, was it?
No, it wasn't. Norman Levy was the NDP government.
Was he a social worker?
Oh yes, he was himself. As a matter of fact, he adopted a son through us.
Mhm.
And we never found, I like Norman Levy as a person, I know him, but we never found him too cooperative about that boy. However, he had 5 children of his own. No, he and Dave Barrett both were in the correction. Dave Barrett worked for Children's Aid Society too.
Mhm.
And then he went over to corrections, and Norman Levy was in corrections. They're both social workers.
Yeah.
But this is what the government had decided, and Dave wasn't premier then. He was second, he was in the opposition, I think, or something. Oh no, I guess he was. Let me see now, if I got my facts right there. At any rate, it was Norman, who was Ministry of the Human Resources, who announced this at the annual meeting.
At the annual meeting of the Children's Aid Society?
Yeah. And it was a bit of a shock to many because they hadn't fully realized that. They may have heard about it, but they hadn't fully appreciated it as being a reality. And of course, I think that Dorothy Coombe and Dorothy Beck both felt, and all of us felt, that something of value would be lost. Now, I'm sure they're trying to do their best, whatever job they're doing, I don't know. But it's one of many facets within the agency. Instead of being a major emphasis. I don't know what it's like in other provinces, but I think they still maintain Children's Aid Societies elsewhere.
In Ontario, and to a certain extent in Nova Scotia, I think.
Yeah.
That's
It might be administratively better. I don't really know that. But that's what happened with the
Yeah.
homemaker service too, and I can come to that later. Exactly
Sure.
the same thing.
Perhaps now would be a good time to move on to your topic.
Well,
of
I
homemaker
graduated, as I call it, in 1972, and I reached my age of 65.
service. Mhm.
And I asked to stay on, but I was told you're 65. I could have got a part-time job there, but I didn't want it. And there was this opening at the homemaker services.
Mhm.
So I thought I'd take it. Derek Thompson, it was still connected with the Family Service Bureau then.
Mhm.
Derek Thompson interviewed me, and I got that job, and I went to work almost a few days afterwards. And my main job then was, it's interesting there because that was just a young agency then too. I was given a list of homemakers to place in various various homes where they were required. And I supervised the homemakers to some degree. And there were 8 people in their office altogether. That was the size of it on 7th Avenue. And I worked there for some time, and then Diane Cox was in charge. And after a time, began to do a little group discussions with homemakers. We had groups, and I used to do that in various centers. And also I took part in the orientation of new homemakers. And this went on for some time. They had very serious financial difficulties in 1978. The place had become very big. They had opened up an office in Richmond. We had one in Burnaby since I was, while I was there, and one in Vancouver, of course. North Vancouver used to use that service, but they changed that, and it was transferred to the Metropolitan Health Unit instead. Anyway, I took some of the courses, the training that the homemakers took. At least I sat in some of the classes. And during the 7 years I was with them, I'd say 5 years full-time, 2 years only part-time. It grew like a mushroom from maybe 50 or 60 homemakers who were almost permanently engaged in their jobs. They then had about a couple of hundred, and they were no longer permanent. They did 4 hours service here and 4 hours service there, wherever needed, and that sort of thing. Then in 1978, it was 1978, I believe, they opened the Richmond office, and Diana wanted to reorganize the administration part of it. She also had a computer system installed, which I know nothing about. But the workers in the district offices thought they could handle some of it themselves, you see. By the time I was doing part-time, I was only doing my group sessions, which I continued because I had groups of homemakers. We used to get together and discuss problems. And I was doing part-time answering the phone in the morning at home, placing sick homemakers who couldn't go to work that day, that sort of thing. Relatively easy to what I'd been doing. And then in 79, I suggested that I retire because it was a new trend developing altogether. It was getting big. And the district offices felt they could handle that kind of thing themselves, probably, and that was fine. So I suggested that I retire, and that was very nice. They gave me a beautiful send-off. Anyway, in 1980, the government stepped in. Well, it was early 1980, I believe. I was asked to be on the board, which I did. I was a member of the board for a while there. And the government stepped in because the bank was no longer financing them. They were having a dreadful time financially. And this was a service the government was buying. And the government sent in an investigation group to find out what the trouble was and all that, and what recommendations they could make. And actually they took over, really. Then some of the old members on the board dropped out And I stayed on for about a year and then I dropped out too.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
I'd had it. But the homemaker service itself was extremely interesting.
Mhm.
When we started out, the emphasis was not only sick people, but people with family problems is what we originally wanted it to be, to prevent taking children out of their homes and placing them elsewhere. Well, this, I believe they're still doing a little of this, but not as much.
Much, right.
It's now the government instituted that new program a couple of years ago. What is that now? Long-term care,
Mhm.
in which the largest percentage are people out of hospital, old people. They do give them the service, elderly people,
Mhm.
and of course some of the others. I think there's something like 500 homemakers now,
Amazing.
and it's run by the government, you might say. They have a new board entirely.
Mhm.
And I don't know whether they call it a government agency now, but it might as well be because they're directing most of the operations. And they have a
Mhm.
new director who's employed by them.
Mhm.
So, but the homemaker service as such was, I think, excellent as far as it went.
Mhm.
It could go much further.
Further.
There's lots of room for improvement.
Okay, I'm wondering if I can do a little bit of jumping here. There's
Mhm.
a question which I neglected to ask, which I would like your views on, and then we could move to some sort of summary questions, if that would be all right.
Fine.
One, if we can jump back in time from 1980 back to the 40s and the war years.
Mm-hmm.
Vancouver was the center of the internment of the Japanese Canadians
Yes,
during that
there
time.
were.
And that happened in 1942. As a member of the Jewish community, who
I
I
had
assume
the 48 children from overseas,
you were
the displaced orphans.
the displaced orphans.
Yeah.
Well, what I was going to ask you about
Yeah.
was, as a member of another displaced group, in
Yeah.
a sense, how you were affected by, or how you felt about what was happening with the Japanese Canadians.
We thought it was dreadful. I
Were you
happen to
afraid?
know a little Japanese family down the street from where our building was. They were the nicest family. They had to move. And I felt so badly for them. But, you know, we're caught up in the war like anyone else. You hope the government knows what it's doing, you know.
Mhm.
But it was a pretty awful situation, really, for these people. They all had to go into a camp, and they were decent living people, many of them Canadians, born Canadians even. And it seemed so unfair. But I think as far as I was concerned, we were more wrapped up in our own troubles, I'm afraid, because when I was at the Children's Aid Society is when I took over from my predecessor there, the group of displaced orphans from Europe, which was all at the same time,
This would have been, what, 1947 or so?
1948.
And these were children,
They were
Jewish
mostly Jewish children.
children?
And the Canadian Jewish Congress had brought about their immigration to Canada. There were I don't know how many were brought to Canada, something like a couple of thousand, I think. But 48 landed up in Vancouver. And my predecessor, a Jewish girl too, who worked at Children's Aid Society, had helped to place those children. And I took over from her in supervising their placements. And that was an interesting group. They had been in a central place in Germany. And of course their parents are all gone. And some of the interesting things I learned, that those whose families had been solid to begin with came through it quite good.
Mhm.
You know, they were nervous kids. They were worried about their future, but they were stable in most senses. And they were more high-strung than you would find the average youngster
Mhm.
nowadays. But there were 2 or 3 families that came from broken homes to begin with,
Mhm.
which had nothing to do with Hitler. There was a family of 4 from Belgium, and they had gone through both experiences, you see. And we had most trouble with them.
Mhm.
But they have settled. They have settled here. Most of them are still in Vancouver. 2 or 3 went to Israel afterwards.
Mhm.
But that was responsible for their care for several years.
Helping them stabilize and integrate.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. One of the things that I've neglected, another of the things that I've neglected to ask is about your involvement with professional association over the years.
Oh, yes. Well, I must admit I haven't been involved recently. You mean the CASW? I haven't been. What I am at present is president of the Golden Age Club of Senior Citizen. I find that enough.
Mm-hmm.
And I have been on a board of a mentally retarded association too. And I haven't really involved myself too much in this association because I found that my energies were of a limited nature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But I used to go quite regularly at one time to their meetings and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I have been a board member for 9 years on the Association for the Mentally Retarded.
You have a special interest in that field, I
Yeah,
understand.
my son is retarded and I have been interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I've been on the board of the, what was it? I was on the Homemaker Services for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And the Golden Age Club at present, which I've been 4 years with that, and I want to get off, and they don't let me.
With someone as active as you, they may not let you for a while.
Well,
Just a couple of summary questions then, if I might. One is, as you look back over the years in which you've been doing social work and social service type work, if there are accomplishments of which you're particularly.
my accomplishments? Oh dear, is a difficult one. I think I've learned what my accomplishments were. I don't know. I think someone else would have to tell you that. But I think I've learned not to take anything or anyone for granted, or to conclude there's only one way of doing things, and that there's lots and lots of room for development and improvement. And yes, we did a good job from time to time, an isolated incidents I can think of that I'm rather pleased about. But, and we weathered the storm, you might say, along with a lot of other people during the worst years. I think maybe there are people who have come to me and said, well, you know, you were very good to us, or something of the sort.
Mm-hmm.
And that's about the size of it. How valuable that was, I guess they can best feel that rather than I can say it.
Okay. And finally, if I might ask you what it has meant to you to be a professional social worker?
Well, it's the thing I wanted to be, and I've enjoyed my work all through the years. I never could have said that I was bored or that I didn't. I felt I chose the right profession for me, and I enjoyed it, every minute of it. There were times when it was very hard because the type of thing we tackled, there was no one solution to it. But I enjoyed the challenge very much. I always did and I enjoyed the School of Social Work. Particularly, I think that I was especially favored or privileged because I had the opportunity to hear different people who were really very well versed in the field of social work,
Mm-hmm.
and to gain from their knowledge. I think that's about all I could say about
Okay.
that.
I'm wondering then if in conclusion there's anything you'd like to add.
Well, I hope that this has some purpose or value, at least for, I would say to any young person starting out, not to try to tackle everything all at once. They won't solve everything all at once. To take it more calmly, and to remember that we aren't God, but it's worthwhile the effort. That's about all I can.
Okay, I want to thank you very much for your time this morning. It's been very enjoyable and very educational for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So,
Take your
that's it.
microphone off here.
Okay, I'm rolling now.
This is a plaque, is that what you call it?
Mhm.
That was presented to me at the annual meeting of the Children's Aid Society in 1972. And it conferred a life membership on me and said some very kind words about my efforts and my contribution to the child welfare, Canadian child welfare. They even say Canadian child welfare has been enhanced by her ceaseless dedication, believe it or not, and search for new techniques and her skill of interpreting her profession by public speaking and written articles.
Okay, thanks.
And that's about it. This is a photograph of two lovely children, which was taken by the son of my former boss at the Community Homemaker Services and presented to me at their annual meeting as a gift in appreciation for my services. And on the back, it says, it was then the International Year of the Child, and it was in happy remembrance of your dedicated service to the agency and your many years of concern and care for children. August 1979, received this letter inviting me to a special meeting, rather it was the annual meeting at which they were going to present the picture I've just shown you. And they asked me to do the honors then of giving out pins. This is a letter I really like, and that was from the Children's Aid Society. But that was conferring inviting me to their annual meeting for conferring the honorary life membership of the society on me. That's all you need to say. The president said, I know there are many adults today who think of you not as their caseworker, but as a friend and a vital part of their maturing process. Your full investment of yourself to help others is exemplified in the vital part you played in the Jewish Overseas Relief Program, etc., etc. Gets to be a bit.
That's great.
Okay.
Okay, so then what we can do is just do the title page there where it has does it have the article in your name? The article was published, particularly the when, and then tell me what you told me in the when.
I'll just see right now. This was May 1966, which is
Earlier
an
even.
awfully long, I've forgotten the date even.
So,
What do you want me to do, just put that up there or what?
let's see. I'll put this up there, maybe this will hold it.
Yeah. Most of us believe that the family is still very important. But,
Because you told me in the card that things hadn't changed.
Yes.
So,
I was asked to write an article in May 1966 for the Pulse magazine. Who put this out anyway? On protection of children. And I was just rereading it the other day and was startled by the fact that the details in that article are so apropos to what is happening today.
the conditions haven't changed so very much concerning the welfare of children that maybe we still need a great many resources to help them and to do a good job. But I gave some illustrations of children who were in need of protection, and also quoted the American Child's Bill of Rights, and how children were being referred, which is very much the same as today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay?